Good morning. It's good to see everybody today. Everybody's bright. Okay, some interesting things we're covering here in the book of 1 Corinthians. Some illustrations that we're not used to. The one we were talking about when our time ran out last week was about the foundation. Well, not the foundation, but what is built on the foundation. The foundation is Christ. Nothing wrong with the foundation, but it's what we build on it that may make a difference. Paul talks about two different kinds of materials. Some of it is silver and gold and precious stones. That's one kind of material. And the other is what? Wood, hay, and stubble. And those are different qualities. And we're talking about how good they are, how likely they are to survive fire. If they were tested by fire, which would do better? Well, obviously the silver and gold and the precious stones would do better. Wood, hay, and stubble would be almost like pouring gasoline on it because they'd go right up in flames. So we're not talking about whether wood is a good building material. It is. We need it for certain things. But the thing that Paul is talking about here, he's talking about, still got in mind preachers. Goes back to first chapter where we're talking about people naming themselves after preachers. He's still dealing with that. And he says things continually that refer back to it. But these things that building materials that they build on the foundation refer to the people. The church is made up of people, isn't it? Some people are good soil. Some are not. You're not locked in. You can change the kind of soil you are if you want to. The Corinthians needed to know what kind of material, building material they were. So this is kind of a left-handed way of Paul censuring the Corinthians because they thought they were qualified to decide the question, who's the greatest preacher? Kind of like that argument that his apostles got in before that long time ago when they were trying to decide who's the greatest among us. And Jesus wouldn't even tell them that. Jesus didn't try to tell them who's the greatest. He didn't try to settle that argument. And so these arguments over who's the greatest preacher, which is kind of what that was, people naming themselves after their favorite preacher, Jesus refused to get involved in that kind of an argument over who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. However, the laborer would not lose his reward if the quality of the material he used to build with was good and could withstand fire. He could still be saved even though the material burned up that he built with. So this is talking about people. Some people are receptive to the gospel. Some temporarily are receptive to the gospel. Some are there for the long haul. They're going to be there, rain or shine, no matter what. But there are different kinds of building material that are used to make up a church. And Paul keeps going back to this. It's not he that does the watering or he that does the planting. It's God who gives the increase. We need to keep the focus on God. We're workers together with God, he says. So what an honor it is to be a helper or a co-worker with God. Think about that. Instead of thinking about who your favorite preacher is and all that kind of thing. We're going to talk some more about this as we consider. In verse 9, he tells them, you are God's building. So we don't have to wonder who the building is. I wish I'd have thought to remember I have an illustration of it looks like a church building, but it's made up of people. And that's what we need to think of. The word church has come, a word is used or defined in the dictionary according to how people use it. People use the word church to refer to a building, but that's not what it meant originally. And if we're going to get a biblical usage of it, we're going to still use it, not to refer to this building, but to refer to the people. They're the building. The church is people. And so we need to think of it like that. But now he shifts from the act of building to the thing built. And we'll notice that here in verse 9. And again, the emphasis is on God. You are God's building. And so to oneself, to name oneself after Paul or Apollos or Cephas was inappropriate because the church didn't belong to them, it belonged to God. This is not the church of Paul, this is not the church of Cephas. It's the church of Christ that belongs to him. So, and he says in verse 10, but unto us revealed unto them through this, let me get in the right chapter here, chapter 3, verse 10, according to the grace of God which was given unto me as a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let each man take heed how he buildeth thereon. Well, there's several things contained in there. This puts some responsibility on the preacher here, doesn't it? The materials he used. Now you might say, well, he doesn't have anything to do with the kind of people that hear him preach. No, he doesn't necessarily have that, but people who are converted or what they're converted by, that may determine. Maybe we need to approach it from that standpoint. We can get a lot of numbers on that board if we change our ways, but it wouldn't be for the best biblically. We could talk about all the fun we're having here. We could bring in some people, talented people to entertain and mix that with our singing and all that. We could do a lot of things, have all kinds of programs, all kinds of fun things going on for the kids, bouncy houses, all those things, carnal appeals to attract people, and you can get a lot of numbers with that. It works if that's your goal, just numbers. But what kind of building material have you got? Have you got people that were converted by a suffering Savior on the cross? Where you see his hands bleeding, his feet bleeding, you see his side. Are you converted by a person who would do that for you and for your sins and for you? There's no other hope than him. If that's the thing that converted you, then you're going to be silver and gold and precious stones. But if you were drawn in by carnal appeals, that's not the right reason. And that's not what makes a church strong. What makes church strong is truly converted people, not people who are brought in by all kinds of other things. And so that may be a difference we can make here, and there may be a lot more here than that. But in the quality of the material that's built, what was it that caused you to become a member? Was it those things, something else other than, because the cross is the only thing Jesus gave us. That's the only thing we need to be using to draw people. And did you have your hand up, Steve?
No.
I thought you had your hand up. Okay. Well, so Paul says, according to the grace which was given me. Paul considered it a matter of grace that he was afforded this opportunity to preach the gospel. And no question, some preachers have more ability than others. Some have more opportunities than others do. And all that any of us have comes from God. Paul says that. He tells the Ephesians that it all comes from God. And sometimes preachers may consider their lot to be a burdensome task, a drudgery, while Paul considered it to be a matter of grace. Difference in looking at it that way, isn't it? It makes a difference in the world how you look at it. For the preacher and everybody else too. If he's looking at it as a drudgery and burdensome, that attitude is going to carry over to the people he's dealing with too, and they're going to have that same thing toward Christianity. That's not the right thing. So Paul said that he was going to approach it as a wise master builder. There's where we mentioned that word builder here from the word architecton, which is where we get our word architect. And Paul considered his work to be that of an architect. And he's laid the foundation. Somebody else is going to come along and build on it. And he's the person who plans the work, who lays it out, all of that. He knew exactly what it takes to make God's building what it ought to be. And Paul's work at Corinth could kind of be compared to that. His work at Corinth could be compared to that of an architect. And it wasn't that of a novice, but a skillful, experienced architect he was. And he implicitly denied being responsible for the division at Corinth. He denied being that. In fact, Paul would have disputed and refuted anybody who said, "I am of Paul." He would have been there refuting that, and exactly what he needed to be doing. You wonder about some of the other guys whose names they're calling themselves after, and it wasn't really Paul and Cephas and Apollos. He said, "I substituted those names for your sakes." Apparently, other names that we don't know what they were, that people had their favorites and were naming themselves after them. So Paul denied being responsible for that. He refuted the idea of anybody that would say, "I am of Paul." That would be wrong to say that. But he did say, "Other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Paul." No, he didn't say that, which is Christ. Christ is the foundation, not Paul, not Peter. And anybody who builds on anything else has succeeded only in building some other kind of a structure than the Lord's church. They haven't built that. And so men do build on different foundations, and those can't be called God's building. They can't be called that. So the sole foundation is Christ, not Peter or Paul, not a pope, not anybody else. Now the work of those that came after Paul was just there a year and a half. There were going to be people coming there after Paul that were going to be building on the foundation, which had already been laid. He laid the foundation when he was there. But if one is going to build a structure of any sort, of any kind, then wood would not be considered would not be considered inferior building. We have a lot of wood in this building even. And that's not the point of the passage, and I want to keep emphasizing that, whether wood's good or poor building material, but rather how it would stand up under a fire. And we all know the answer to that. Fire would consume wood, not the other things. So what are the gold and the silver and the precious stones? And what are the wood, the hay, and the stubble? They're building materials, aren't they? But they're people. They're people. And so a preacher does bear some responsibility. If he's trying to attract people by carnal means, other than the pure gospel, and that's what he makes the building out of, then that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem.
Nick,
Yes, Steve?
With that being said, a newborn Christian comes into church as a baby. He may be wood at that point, but he has to be developed into a stone. I mean, in other words, he grow into that precious stone. You don't just start off like that. Well, some people do, but it's a process of getting there. But some people refuse to. You come in, you have the parable of the sower.
Yeah.
The parable of the sower. Some people receive the word with readiness, but the world choked them out. The pleasures of the world choked them out.
Yeah.
So they remain the wood and the stubble. And when fire came, it burned them up. So you may come in as a piece of wood, stubble or whatever, but you have to grow into that precious stone.
Yeah, finally, that's what it will be. Yeah, and his foundation, Paul says, although his work may be burned up, he may be saved if he did his job, because the Lord required the effort of him. He didn't require the results of him.
So in other words, if I persuade somebody to become a Christian, then that work of mine is okay. But it's up to that person from that point on to become that precious stone or whatever.
We're all building toward that. That's true. We're trying to grow toward that.
Yes.
But at the same time, depending on what a person is attracted by, it should be the cross. That should be the only thing we use, is the cross. And if the only thing we use is the cross, that's the thing that's going to attract them, isn't it? And so they won't be attracted by something else. So it makes a difference what kind of building materials are being used here. And let's notice, as we look at the next question, part of the question here, and some people have suggested that Paul's talking about doctrines here. I don't think he's talking about doctrines. That's not the building material that he's talking about, because you can't build on false doctrine or on heresies, things like that. He wouldn't still be saved if he was building on false doctrine. But here, the man can still be saved, though his work is burned up. So it shows it's not talking about false doctrines, because he couldn't build on that. So a better view is the converted person, the person who's truly converted. And that's the kind of thing he's talking about here. And so it's still possible for a preacher to labor, and his labor to be in vain, but he himself still be saved, because Paul talked about some of his failures. He talked about some of the failures he had where he had labored in vain. He mentions that in other of his books, other of his letters, that he had labored in vain. So I think we can see that it's talking about people. But in verse 13, he said, every man's works will be made manifest. They'll be seen for what they are. And he won't be able to hide it, or he won't be able to obscure it in any way. It will ultimately be revealed. And the day that he refers to here, there in verse 13, let's look at it again. Each man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it is revealed in fire, and the fire itself shall prove each man's work of what sort it is. And at that time, a man's work will become apparent for what it is, what they are. And so the second coming will be the final judgment, in which the gold and the silver and the precious stones and all of that will be clear, the wood, hay, and stubble, all of that will be clearly evident then for what they are. But let's look at verses 14 and 15 of chapter 3. 14 says, if any man's work shall abide, which he built thereon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as through fire. So he can suffer loss, and he can still be saved. That is, if those he converted turned out not to be good material. And so Paul mentioned several times that he had suffered some losses. But let's look at question number 9. I meant to put these up here. Let me see. I think I got them. Question number 9. Paul warns against worldly wisdom, which is foolishness with God. He says in 1 Corinthians 3:19. what are some modern ideas and philosophies that the world considers to be wise but are foolish from a biblical perspective? What are some of those? Well, there are a lot of them.
The health and wealth gospel.
Okay, that's one right there. Health and wealth gospel. You're going to attract the wrong kind of building material with that, aren't you? If you're preaching the health and wealth gospel, and you can get a lot of that on TV, from the mega churches and all that. If you're building on that, I mean, you'll build a mega church out of that. But what's the quality? How will it stand on the day of judgment? Won't be precious stones and silver and gold and all that. What are some others? What about premillennialism? The reason I mention that, because that's always been popular. There's been a whole series of books, Left Behind, and people are so wrapped up in what's happening in Israel and all of that, thinking that everything that happens over there is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, things of that kind. And you can get people all excited about that. And they'll buy those books. So those were some bestsellers. People made a lot of money off of those. The Late Great Planet Earth, the one by Hal Lindsey, and other books like that, and some of them have been made into movies even. They get people started up. But that's not the foundation. I mean, that's not the building material that we ought to be using. Some people build on other things, evolution, things of that kind. People can be wrapped up in that, all the things about that. But back to Corinth and our 10th question here. Let's go on to the 10th question. Question number 10, Paul advises, if anyone among you think that he is wise in this age, let him become a fool that he may become wise. Verse 18. What does it look like to become a fool for Christ in our culture? What does that look like? Troublemakers at Corinth were self-deceived, weren't they? Because they imagined themselves to be somewhat. In fact, he uses the phrase puffed up, doesn't he? We're going to see that phrase used several times in 1 Corinthians, that somebody was puffed up, and then he gets to chapter 13, he talks about love is not puffed up. If you're puffed up, you don't have the kind of love you need to have. So they were thinking too highly of themselves. They were deluded in that. Apparently they thought they were some special kind of something special because of whom they selected as the head of their party, based on that. For example, the one who said, I'm of Paul, showed that in his own eyes he was wiser than the one who said, I'm of Apollos. Each one of them thought they were wiser than the others. And that stirred up all kinds of jealousy and strife. He says it did. And so long as that kind of situation continued, trouble was going to remain at Corinth. It needed to be resolved. It needed to be solved. They couldn't just let it keep on like it was. And no wonder Paul appealed for this self-delusion to stop. It needed to stop. And if any man thinks himself to be wise in this world, Paul's still dealing with those in Corinth who had a tendency to look at the gospel in terms of human philosophy, what it could do for them in this world. Those persons who thought that they were superior in their wisdom, because of their wisdom, those who were wise in this world, who were spoiled through philosophy and vain deceit, as he mentions over in Colossians 2 and verse 8. Human philosophy compared to the divine revelation of God. That's the contrast that was there. We're going to go by human philosophy, which had a lot more attractions to it, or we're going to go by what has been divinely revealed from heaven. That was their question they had to answer. And they were overly attracted to this human philosophy. There was a lot of things attractive about it. They had misconceptions about the gospel of Christ and also its preachers. They had that misconception. So the one who is wise according to this world is a fool before God, and he who is wise before God is a fool to this world. And we are fools to this world. Somebody wrote a book I think it was based on the life of Alexander Campbell, called Fools for Christ. And it's talking about how we're looked at in the eyes of the world. Fools for Christ, but not fools for God, to God. And that makes a difference, big difference. And when Paul talks about the things of the world, he's not depreciating science or chemistry or physics, anything like that. He's criticizing the tendency to judge the gospel on the basis of the findings of science or philosophy rather than God's word as truth. And a lot of people do that. They want to base it on that. If you don't have some kind of empirical evidence that Jesus was raised from the dead, you can't put your finger on it, and it all relies on faith, on the record, the written record, then they're not going to have anything to do with it. It's got to be from the natural world, things from the natural world. And so any understanding on any subject has to begin with God's revelation on that subject. That's the way it has to begin. But let's look at number 11. In the final verses, Paul reminds the Corinthians that all things are yours because you are Christ. Those are the final 2 or 3 verses of chapter 3. How does that perspective free us from boasting in human leaders and worldly achievements? How does it do that?
Because it makes you realize that all things are God, not yours. You don't own anybody.
Okay, that's true.
You're just a steward.
And Paul lists the names of those who were considered to be heads of these different parties in the church, still using the names of Paul and Cephas and Apollos, whom he said they belong to the Corinthians. He didn't include Christ in that. You notice he left the group out that would call themselves after Christ. Apparently they're the only right group there. They're the ones who said, I am of Christ. And he doesn't mention them here. And so we can't correctly say Christ belongs to the church, because instead the church belongs to Christ. And that may be the reason why he left out those who were naming themselves after Christ. And Christ is God's, and God is the authoritative. God is the subordinate to Christ is the subordinate to God. And that's what he's saying in those last 2 or 3 verses there. And in trying to curtail this division in the church at Corinth. And Paul appealed to the exalted positions in the church in relationship to the preachers. And preachers serve the church. Remember, we're all servants. Ministers means servant. It's not a title, not a dignitary, anything like that. And all the preachers existed for the benefit of Corinth. And to say I'm of Paul is to limit his relationship rather than to exalt him, because that doesn't connect you to Christ. And so Paul is still dealing with the problem. And I think that was our last question on that, wasn't it? Any comments or questions on chapter 3? Believe it or not, we're about to get in chapter 4. About to get in chapter 4. And I have to bring up the questions on chapter 4, so let me get out of this one here. And there they are. Okay, our chapter 4, and we've been reading the chapter each time. Most of these chapters are not very long. So this one's 21 verses. So let's just go through it really quickly. Let a man so account of us as of ministers of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Here, moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not mine own self. For I know nothing against myself, yet am I not hereby justified. But he that judgeth me is the Lord. Wherefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord come, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and make manifest the counsels of the hearts. And then shall each man have his praise from God. We'll stop there at those first 5 verses and discuss those. Then we'll get to the rest of the chapter. But notice these questions here. And the first one is, what is a minister and what is a steward? So let's do the first one. What is a minister? A servant. Okay, a minister is a servant. And this shows that it's important what we think of a preacher. We pointed out, Paul says preachers are nothing, but but God who gives the increase is the one. He hasn't said preachers and their work is not important. But what is important is not what we think of preachers, but what God thinks. That's what's important. What does God think? It's not whether the preacher is eloquent or dynamic or anything like that, or how many followers he has. It is, what is it? What's it say there in the first verse? Let a man so account of his as minister of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. Verse 2, here, moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found what? Faithful. Faithful. That's the criteria. He's got to be found faithful. And so these two are mentioned in the same verse, ministers and stewards, and they're intertwined. Is he faithful? And all men of all ages should look on preachers as ministers, servants of Christ. Not as dignitaries, not as heads of parties, not as celebrities or originators of some doctrine. And while the term minister occurs 19 times in the New Testament, this is the only time it's used in 1 Corinthians. The only time. But it occurs 19 times throughout the New Testament. And it refers to a service of any kind which in structure and goal is controlled by the will of him to whom it is rendered. It implies that one accepts subordination, willing obedience. So that's what a servant is. So when we hear of our government officials declared as public servants, we need to focus on that word servant. They're there to serve. And we need to keep that in mind as we look to them. Now, what about the word steward? That's also in this verse. What about stewards? What is a steward? Okay, it's somebody else's property that's in charge of it, but he's responsible for it. And you can see why he would need to be required to be faithful, because that's subject to all kinds of abuse, isn't it, if he's not faithful? And we saw that in cases of some unmerciful servants who took liberties with the belongings of the one who owned the property. And so it's important that a steward be found faithful because he's entrusted with somebody else's things, somebody else's property. And so a steward, he's defined as a kind of chief slave who superintends the household and the whole property of his master. And so here Paul calls himself steward of the mystery, a steward of the mystery. And so that talks about the secret thoughts and the plans of God. He's been entrusted with that. And those things that were hidden from human reasoning, and they can only be known through revelation. God has entrusted. Think about how important that is. We're talking about a revelation from the God of heaven, and you're entrusted with it. What are you going to do with it? You're going to guard it. You're going to take care of it. You're going to value it. And you're going to realize how important it is. That it's the thing that's important, not me, not you, but it. And so Paul is showing us how important that is. If you're a steward, you're entrusted with something very important, very valuable. And God has entrusted preachers with the responsibility to dispense the gospel and to all the world. And Ms. Roy Carruth, that name may not ring a bell, Mrs. Roy Carruth. She expressed it like this, and when I tell you what she said, then you'll immediately know who she is. She said, into our hands the gospel is given, into our hands is given the light, Haste, let us carry God's precious message, guiding the erring back to the right. She wrote those words in the hymn, into our hands the gospel is given. She captured the idea there. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Guiding the erring back to those who preach the gospel of Christ have to recognize the preciousness of their commodity. They need to value it for what it's worth. And God's word has been given to them as a stewardship. And that's our role. And that applies to all Christians as we share the gospel with others as well. So our first question, what is a minister? What is a steward? It's important that we understand those words and what they mean. And we don't let modern definitions of these words take over the biblical meaning of them. And that's helping you. Well, number two, with what have stewards been entrusted, and why is faithfulness the most important test? We've kind of answered that of a steward, but we can talk about that a little bit. If you've ever been in any kind of a management position in a company, your work is kind of that of a steward. You don't own the company, but the owner has entrusted you with a responsibility, hasn't he? If it's running a store of some kind, you've got to make sure that the receipts and everything tally up, don't you? You've got to be responsible. And you've got to think about the welfare of the business. You've got to look at it not just as a job. You're fortunate to have that job. And you want to talk it up. You want to do all you can to promote the business. You don't just punch out and say, I don't care what happens to it while I'm gone. It's not that kind of a thing. You are entrusted with something valuable. And so you want to be a good employee. And the good employee is the one who values that, and he will be recognized by those higher up that this is a person who has the good of the company at heart, and they want us to succeed. And that's the way it should be. That's the way it should be. Any other comments about stewards being found faithful? Trustworthy, dependable, those kind of words that we're thinking about.
Hey, Dick, Dick,
yes.
One word that says trustworthy.
What's that?
The stewards must be trustworthy.
Yeah.
And like you say with a company, you're hired, you don't own it. And I'll give you an example. I was at a job where I had to know the laws and if the company was complying and all that. When the new boss would come in, he'd say, who's going to keep me out of jail? He didn't understand the laws, and I had to raise my hand because he trusted that person in that position to keep him.
To know the law.
Basically, follow the law, which is relevant to this.
Well, that's a good example of what we're talking about. He was looking out for the welfare of the business of the company, and that's a good thing. That made him a good employee. That made him trustworthy. That made him faithful to the job. And we pointed out that God doesn't demand eloquence. He doesn't demand results, but he always requires faithfulness, doesn't he? Eloquent or not, he requires faithfulness. And his responsibility is not to develop new schemes and new philosophical systems like that, but it's to propagate the revelation from God. Because all that's already been decided by God from heaven. He's just to carry out that message. And the power lies in the message and not in the messenger. And that's what we forget when we make a celebrity out of a preacher. The power is in the message, not in the messenger. Okay, number three, why was the Corinthians' evaluation of Paul insignificant to him? Look at what he says in verse 3. Look at verse 3. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not mine own self. What's he saying there? Already. What's he saying there?
With their attitude and with their knowledge of the Bible.
Okay.
What they said about him didn't make any difference because he knew what God said.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And that was man's judgment.
It's God's judgment that matters, doesn't it? That's what matters, is God's judgment. And not that he was disparaging in any way how they felt about him or any human judgment, But Paul, even his own human judge, he said, I don't judge myself in that regard. God, that's God's job to judge me, not mine.
Paul
Steve?
Paul is there to correct them, to set them straight. He had no need for them to set him straight.
That's right. They weren't in a position to do it, obviously. They had failed in that. So he wasn't depreciating their judgment, but all human judgment. He's depreciating all human judgment. What God thinks about it is what matters, not what I or you or anybody else thinks. And some held Paul highly. Some people did. They were in favor of Paul. They wanted to make him the head of their party, so to speak, or he's using that as an illustration. But others depreciated Paul to the point of even denying his apostleship. So you had a wide range of views on the parts of people toward Paul. Some thought he was tops, others didn't think that at all. But a man isn't knowledgeable enough to make an infallible judgment, is he? And that's what that would require. He can't make an infallible judgment. And therefore, man's judgment cannot be trusted.
That's what he said. He said, I judge not my own self.
Yeah. Doesn't matter whether he's sincere or not, a man's judgment cannot be trusted in matters like this because he's not infallible. And so this evaluation of the Corinthians toward their preachers was irrelevant so far as the destiny of the souls of these men were concerned. What they thought about the preacher didn't matter. It just didn't matter. It wasn't important. And so they shouldn't be making such a big deal out of it like they were. Well, let's see if we can get to the fourth question. Why was Paul qualified to know that sincerity, that should be the word was not proof of justification?
Because there's not any man who walketh to direct his own steps.
That's a good answer. And he essentially says there in verses 3 and 4, but with me it's a very small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not mine own self. For I know nothing against myself, yet I am not hereby justified. But he that judgeth me is the Lord. And that's where we need to put it. That's where we need to leave it, isn't it?
John 12:48.
Yeah, John 12:48, yeah. We'll be judged by his words on that last great day. So we're seeing the right attitude, and this ought to be preached all over the world, and really, because we see all kinds of perversions of this kind of thing going on in the religious world. But we're not immune to it either, so we need to apply it to ourselves as well. And then number 5, what qualifies Jesus as judge? That's in verse 5. What qualifies him?
He is the word.
Okay. Wherefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord come, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and make manifest the counsels of the hearts, and then shall each man have his praise from God. There's nothing going to be hidden. He's going to make obvious what's in the hearts of people. And won't be anything that can be hidden from him at that time. It'll be made manifest. So we think about that question. We see what it is we're talking about. That qualifies Jesus as a judge and not us. We don't have what Jesus has. We're not in a position to judge those things. And yet we're good at doing it anyway, aren't we? We often put ourselves in the judgment seat and judge things that really belong to Christ. We can't read other people's minds. We can't say, well, I know you got a bad motive. I can just tell by looking at your face. You can't. You can't do that. You can't do that. We cannot read people's minds. No man knoweth the things of a man save the spirit of man that is in him. We learned that in chapter 2. And we need to remember that. Did the second bell ring? Okay, well, it's about 2, I think. But anyway, we got to number 5 in chapter 4. And we'll pick up there next time. And so be sure to read the rest of that.